Hi everyone, it's Hillel Eisenberg here, back with another episode of Judaism Without Apologizing. This episode I had the honor in interviewing the great Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, someone whose wisdom and humility and piercing Hashkafic clarity has touched hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Rabbi Breitowitz is a Musmach of Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael and a Talmud of Reb Ruderman, and interestingly enough, he is a graduate of Harvard Law School as well as a former law professor at the University of Maryland, before shifting into full-time rabbonis, where he was a rav for a long time in Silver Spring, Maryland. He eventually moved to Eretz Yisrael, where he is now a senior Maggid Shir and lecturer at Ar Sameach in Yerushalayim, where he teaches Gemara and Halacha and philosophy and ethics, sort of a rare blend of depth and warmth and razor-sharp insight. And he also hosts probably the most watched Hashkafic question-answer session in the entire Jewish world. And whether he's discussing complex halachic issues or philosophical questions or the practical struggles of everyday Jewish life, Rabbi Breitowitz brings a voice of authenticity and compassion and unwavering dedication to Torah truth. And we had a fascinating, slightly politically incorrect discussion about a wide variety of topics, including whether or not more people should be doing kiruv. We talked about Zionism. We talked about censorship of podcasts. And I think you're really going to find it quite thought-provoking. So without further ado, let's dive into a discussion with one of Torah Judaism's greatest minds, Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz. In a world where everyone seems to have not just a microphone, but a megaphone, the voices of our Gedolim, our Rabbanim and Roshei Yeshiva far too often seem to get lost in the noise. This podcast is here to change that. I'm your host, Hillel Eisenberg. Join me as we sit down with our nation's leaders as they address the Hashkafic challenges that matter most, without the fluff and without the drama, with truth that doesn't flinch. Buckle up, because this isn't your typical podcast. This is Judaism Without Apologizing. Rabbi Breitowitz, it's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure that you are on the Judaism Without Apologizing podcast. It is
thank you. Great title, and I appreciate it.
I wanna dive right in. I think your basic story is pretty well known, and I want to dive right into asking some questions. I think that you have been at the forefront of answering Hashkafic questions, answering millions maybe at this point in your lifetime, perhaps answering more Hashkafic questions than any single Jew in the world at this point. So I think it's appropriate to start with that topic of the concept of Hashkafa. And we live in a world where there are a million opinions that fly everywhere, and everyone has a podcast, and everyone writes blogs and articles. And unlike 200-300 years ago, where you could have someone in the Haskalah movement, a reformer, write an article. Okay, so you have Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch will counter with an article of his own. But we live in an age where everyone has a fancier podcast than the next. Everyone's got a microphone and a megaphone, and the Rabbanim sort of are relegated towards the technological age of the 1700s, and it's difficult for their voices to get out. So my question to you is, do you think that we are at a point in time where it's a confusing Hashkafic time, where the Rabbanim, the Roshei Yeshiva, the Gedolim need to express their opinions perhaps louder than they did in previous generations?
As Charles Dickens said in A Tale of Two Cities, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. I mean, on one hand, I view the internet as a blessing in many, many ways in terms of the dissemination of Torah. In Or Sameach itself, so many of my shiurim and really other rabbeim shiurim are available for thousands of people to see, theoretically millions of people to see. So on one hand, the accessibility of Torah thought is actually a great blessing, but at the same time, it has many, many great disadvantages. The information overload. There is so much stuff out there, and a lot of it is not authentic. A lot of it is kefira. A lot of it is apikorsis. A lot of it is just worthless. There's good stuff and bad stuff. And a lot of times the truthful voices can get drowned in the plethora of all of the other stuff that's out there. So that creates a tremendous burden on the consumer to be able to be mavchin ben kodesh l'chol, or worse. And it does create, I think, a certain responsibility on the part of Roshei Yeshiva, on the part of Balei Hashkafa, on the part of Balei Masorah, to find some type of avenue in which there could be a greater clarity of what a Torah perspective is. Now, again, I'm the first one to say that the concept of Torah perspective is not monolithic. Within the framework of Torah, there are many legitimate shitos, and I don't mean to say at all that there's only one correct answer to any given question. Nevertheless, there are lines that are drawn in the sand. There are red lines between emes and sheker, and unfortunately, those lines are getting blurred. Now, the problem is, of course, that Rosh Yeshivas and Talmidei Chachamim don't have the time or the inclination to spend their whole time perusing the internet or doing podcasts or whatever it is. And many are not technologically savvy in any event. So part of the job of people like you is to try to identify mechanisms by which some type of emistic adas Torah could somehow be more available, more accessible to a general public that is looking for some type of guidance in very important hashkafic matters.
Do you think podcasts or musical albums should need Hashikmos? Meaning you have a guy, he sits in a beis medrash for 2 decades, he puts out a 12-page kuntris on Baba Kama, and he has 13 Hashikmos, and you have an influencer who has a podcast with 600,000 followers saying anything they want to about every topic under the sun, and we don't bat an eyelash in consuming it. Do you think there should be some sort of systemized standard where this singer singing topics about Hashkafa and Emunah and life, or this podcast delving into, and these are from well-meaning people, in no way am I saying they're not well-meaning, but they're not rooted in Torah, they're not learning in the beis medrash for 3 decades. Should there be some sort of system where there's a haskama, a hechsher given? We put hechsherim on jelly beans, but when it comes to our hashkafa, we seem to be sort of, in the marketplace on our own. Do you think that's like communist Russia, or we should have some form of censorship?
That's a very tough question. I mean, in many ways, I am against censorship to a large degree. I could mention podcasts, for example, that sometimes will have very controversial guests, not for the purpose of espousing their hashkafa, but that the from people should be aware of what's going on there, etc. For example, sometimes they may interview an off the derech, a former Ben Torah who went off the derech. Now, yeah, the guy might be an apikoros or a kofer, but there may be something useful to understand the dynamics of what makes a person go off the derech. So proceed with caution, but I wouldn't automatically be in favor of total censorship. So I don't think I would encourage, active rabbinic oversight as a formal matter. I think a podcaster should have a haskama on his own yiras shamayim, so to speak. Meaning, if you write a sefer, somebody writes a book in English or Hebrew, whatever it is, there'll be a haskama. Now, a haskama, typically, maybe I shouldn't say this, does not mean that the maskim read every single page of the book. Very often, a haskama means a person went over the book generally, and a person may know the author and can affirm that the author is a knowledgeable and responsible ben or bas Torah who is able to communicate Torah ideas in a good way. I could imagine that type of system ought to exist for a podcast. Somebody ought to get at least one reputable rabbi or Talmid Chacham who can say, this guy is not an apikoros, and therefore I think what he says may be worthwhile, although I cannot necessarily agree with every single thing that he says. I don't think that's too much of a burden, and I don't think that would turn into censorship either. So I think censorship would be both a problem of time, and I think inherently, there would be very significant costs with censorship. I mean, I don't want to rehash controversial things, but you may remember years ago the biography of Rav Yaakov, The Making of a Ghetto, which was written by his son, Rabinsteins, Zechronu Livracha, who himself was a Rosh Yeshiva and Talmid Chacham. And for a whole variety of reasons, that book did get censored. And many people feel, including myself, that may have been an unfortunate step in not giving the religious world access to information that might be very, very useful and helpful in dealing with the struggles of their own lives. So I think censorship per se is often too blunt a weapon to deal with kfira, because I think it'll attack other things as well. It's kind of like a lobotomy where you take healthy brain tissue along with diseased brain tissue, and that's not always going to be a good thing. But I think, l'chol hapachot, I would think a podcaster should at least have a rabbinical haskama that he's considered to be a reliable, capable person who generally accurately represents a Torah perspective.
Do you think there is a growing gap between the Hashkafos being taught in yeshivas and seminary and the Hashkafos being absorbed or being lived through media of people 10, 20 years out of seminary or yeshivas? And if there is in fact such a gap, who is responsible for closing that gap?
This is a very, very difficult question. I mean, listen, the world of podcast is a very, very wide world. And there are podcasters who are very solidly in the yeshivish world, and I wouldn't necessarily see any great disconnect there. And then there are podcasts who represent themselves as Orthodox, who are very, very far from the Hashkafas of the yeshiva world. So if the question is there a disconnect? The answer is, with respect to some, there is. With respect to others, there is less. Now, why that's so? There could be a lot of reasons. One is that within Orthodoxy itself, we have the rise of what you might call more left-wing movements, such as Open Orthodoxy, which now I think goes by the name Modern Orthodoxy, because Modern Orthodoxy now goes by the name Centrist Orthodoxy. But whatever the name is, the Hashkafas of Chovevei Torah, which again, I'm not here to condemn anybody, but simply to note that type of Hashkafa is very, very, very different than the Hashkafas of the yeshiva and the Beis Yaakov. So as more and more rabbis from those institutions get pulpits, and more students are out there who are graduates of these institutions, you're going to see more and more of a disconnect. But the truth of the matter is, on the other side of it, and here I may get in very, very big trouble, some of it is actually a healthy process of maturation. Meaning, as one grows up and one deals with family, one has a family, and one deals with the outside world, one understands that although the core of their beliefs and the core of their hashkafos is the Masorah that we got in yeshiva, but it has to be, again, I'm using dangerous words here, but it does have to be modified and applied to scenarios that are very, very different than the world of the yeshiva. And that's going to create a certain disconnect, talking about how to integrate a working life with learning, etc. So, as I say, so one factor is the left-wing movements. The other factor is, as people leave yeshiva, they are dealing with different types of experiences that are different than they faced in the more cloistered world of the yeshiva. A third phenomenon is the need to deal with off-the-derech people, meaning to say there are, Baruch Hashem, I'm not going to call it a tremendous number, but there is a significant number of Orthodox people, not only Baalei Tshuva, but even FFBs and even people who have learned in Kollel, who go off the derech in various ways. And part of the challenge is to try to do things that can help them bring them back. And sometimes the mahalchim that they got in yeshiva are not necessarily going to be the mahalchim that are going to speak to them. And the big challenge that we have is, can we develop mahalchim that are still faithful to the Messiah, that are still based on Torah sources, that are affirming of the Ikrei Amunah, but at the same time in a certain language and terminology that can be understood and accepted to people who might have rejected the way it was presented in the yeshiva world. I mean, one example would be how you deal with conflicts of science and religion. How do you deal with the issues like evolution? How do you deal with the age of the earth? It's one thing, you went to a yeshiva that simply told you evolution is treif, and anyone that says the world is more than 57, now 85 years, is an apikoros. And that's a mahalech that maybe a high school student can just hear. Problem is, as you get more scientifically sophisticated, the questions become more acute. Now, there may be different mahalchim within the Messiah how to address it, and the yeshiva world tended to choose a particular mahalech within the Messiah, but sometimes we may have to revive other mahalchim. Again, I'm just talking out loud, so to speak. I'm not here to issue any final pronouncements, but I'm just giving various reasons why there may be a little bit of a disconnect between the Torah Hashkafos of the internet, of cyberspace, versus the pure Torah Hashkafos of the yeshiva world. I also want to mention, too, another aspect, and that's Hasidus and Kabbalah. In the traditional Litvish yeshiva world, so we emphasized Gemara and Halacha and Musar, but even authentic Hasidus had very, very little role, and certainly minyanim of Kabbalah were not talked about today, and really the Vilna Gaon predicted it, not Hasidus per se, but in terms of Kabbalah, as we approach Mashiach, the light of Kabbalah will be more learnt and more accessible to people in various ways. So as a result, part of the way things were taught 20, 30, 40 years ago are not necessarily going to be the way things are going to be taught today, because different types of ideas come to the forefront. But that's been the history of Klal Yisrael. I mean, in theory, if somebody comes up with a totally new idea, that's bad. I mean, how can you have a totally new idea? But what happens in Yiddishkeit is that everything is there. But sometimes certain ideas recede into the background, other ideas come to the forefront, other times a different process takes place in the reverse. So that, I think, is what we see with podcasts and various other ways of communicating information.
Very interesting. So I want to pivot to another topic. In the 1700s, I think historians estimate that around 90% of Jews were either religious or traditional. And I think the complete opposite is true now, with around 90% of Jews worldwide being irreligious, and the assimilation rate around the world is reaching astronomical numbers. So my first question is, what would you say caused this problem? And should the typical religious Jew care about this problem, or do anything about this problem, or even think about this problem?
It is an interesting phenomenon, and again, it's something that's very, very tragic that we often don't think about. When Napoleon was invading Russia, and Napoleon really promised that the Jews would be liberated from anti-Semitic restrictions, the fall of the ghetto walls, etc. So many people were praying that Napoleon should be menatseach over Russia, because that would be much better for the Jews. The Baal HaTanya said, as oppressive as the Tsar was, the Jews will do better in Russia than they'll do under Napoleon, because it's precisely when Jews are not given civil rights, and they're not given access to secular education, and they're not given access to assimilate with the non-Jewish world, that they turn their kochos inward. In many ways, as difficult as this is kind of a hidden blessing of anti-Semitism. Robert Rebbe himself said, it was easier to be Jewish in Siberia than suburbia. So in many ways, what has called a precipitous decline in spirituality was the fact that Jews were liberated from the ghetto. I mean, 300 years ago, if you were a very, very intelligent Jew, young man, you could not go, by and large, I'm simplifying a little bit, but generally speaking, you could not go to university, you could not go to medical school. Again, there were exceptions even then. So your kochos were directed into Limud HaTorah. There was literally no other avenue for you to go to. But once we have all of these opportunities opening up, so now a bright person says, why should I be a Talmud Chacham and live in poverty? I could be a lawyer, doctor, and make a good living and be respected among the goyim, etc. So I would have to say that a lot of the precipitous yerida in the religiosity of Klal Yisrael came in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the 19th century essentially, where the ghetto was collapsing. And when the ghetto collapsed, like we saw Salanter once gave a mashal, it was like wild horses that are simply released from the carriage and they're going downhill. There's no way to stop them till they hit bottom. That's why he thought he could do kiruv in Germany more than in Poland and Russia, because Germany, he says, the Yidden had already hit bottom with the reform movement. Poland and Russia, they were still wild horses going down the hill. Now, should Jews be concerned about this? Well, it's interesting that if you would have asked the question 50, 60 years ago, maybe 70 years ago, many would have said that there's nothing we can do about it. Unfortunately, we have to write off 70, 80, 85% of Klal Yisrael, and we have to concentrate on the Sheris HaPleita, the faithful remnant that remains stark. But Baruch Hashem, I think we've discovered with institutions like Or Sameach, like Eish Torah, Machon Shlomo, many institutions like that there is a thirst out there. There is a Pintel Yid, that there is a spark of Judaism, even among people who have been removed from Torah for many, many generations. And as a result, for us to simply write them off and not care would show a callousness, would show an indifference, would show a lack of Ahavas Yisrael. And as the Rambam says, it's also a lack of Ahavas Hashem. Because if you truly love Hashem, you're not going to let Hashem's children wander away. Because how does a parent feel? You tell a parent that had 10 children who lost 8 of their children that, well, don't feel so bad, you have 2 of your kids left. Well, what about the 8 out of 10 that aren't there? So, in Or Sameach, just a few months ago, we lost our beloved Rosh Hashiva, the founder of Or Sameach, Rav Nata Schiller, Zichrono Livracha. And he, with Rav Noach Weinberg and Rav Mendel Weinbach and Rav Yaakov Rosenberg, they were visionaries in the sense that now a thing that is so accepted in Klal Yisrael, to create a Torah education framework of Jewish outreach to the unaffiliated. Well, 50, 60 years ago, this was a bizarre idea that many, many people did not accept. And I think Baruch Hashem, we're trying to come to the plate and deal with it. And again, there's so much more to do. With all of the successes of the Baal Tshuva movement, it's still only a drop in the bucket. So there's much, much more that we have to do.
My follow-up question to you is that, would you say, even despite the tremendous success, almost unprecedented success that the Baal Tshuva movement and Eish and Or Sameach, etc. have had in the last 50, 60 years,
yep.
I would throw Reb Shlomo Freifeld in there. The typical, I live in America. I learn in a large yeshiva that has 10,000 bachrim in it, or yungalite. No one does kiruv. No one has, I shouldn't say no, very, very, very few people have a chavrusa once a week with someone on the phone. You don't have to see them. You don't have to go to their house. You don't have to meet their wife. It's very taboo. It's not on the forefront. And something as simple, I know in Eretz Yisrael, Reb Shach was very adamant that every single person in Panovich should have an hour chavrusa once a week with an unaffiliated person. But the Gedolim, for whatever reason, in America, either felt not that way or never spoke about it. And the current situation in America is certainly an indifference at best, or a laziness at the least. And my question to you is this good? I mean, there's obviously tremendous focus on Limud Torah, which is fantastic. My question is, does there need to be a heightened focus on kiruv? And many, many, many thousands of people would benefit from a 1 hour a week learning chavrusashaft on the phone. But the Rabbanim and the Rosh Yeshiva, at least in America, do not stress that whatsoever.
Well, it is very interesting. I remember when I was in Yeshiva many, many years ago, there was a letter from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Zichrono Livracha, in which he talked about the idea of meiser bisman, that just as a person gives 10% of their income to tzedakah, a ben Torah should give 10% of his learning time towards kiruv v'chaikim, to bring people to Yiddishkeit. So this was a letter that I believe was issued already in the late 1960s, or at least the early 70s. So I think it was recognized. And the truth is, if I assume the yeshiva you're talking about is Lakewood, right? That Beis Medrash Kabbalah. Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, you're there, so you know better than me. But I hear of numerous different types of outreach initiatives that Talmidim, or certainly graduates of Beis Medrash Kabbalah, do. I mean, we have the community kololim throughout the United States that, in addition to 2 learning siddharim, do have active outreach programs. See, Rav Aaron Kotler's Hashkafa overall was the famous Hashkafa of the overflowing Kiddush cup. In other words, Rav Aaron felt, instead of telling a ben Torah, go out and be makarev, Rav Aaron had the shita that learn and steig and fill yourself up with Torah till there's so much that's in you that mimela it overflows onto others. And I have to say that the emes is, that's a hashkafa that I myself subscribe to. I wouldn't tell a guy, first year Beis Medrash, to go out, and in kiruv v'chaikim. So what Rav Aaron said is very wise and very, very true. But at some point, you're correct. The guy's been learning for a long time. So nobody is telling him, go out and join Eshet Torah or Sameach. Stay in the Beis Medrash, stay in the Kailo, but find some way, find some eifen in which you can also help a fellow Jew become close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it may very well be that what's going on here is not necessarily indifference, but they simply don't know what to do and how to do it. So if perhaps within the yeshiva world, different yeshivas could have kiruv coordinators, like shatchanim, people who can kind of match up and offer opportunities, even if it's a Shabbos meal or learning 1 hour a week, I think more people would take it. A lot of people really do want to help, but they just don't know what to do. They also figure that, if in order for me to do kiruv, I have to give all of the terutzim about evolution or age of the earth or whatever, or proofs for God. But people don't want to do that, because Ben Torah typically does not, for right or for wrong, that's another question, typically does not get that involved in those questions. So the one message I want to give is, don't think that that's the only thing that matters. Yeah, those of us in our Sameach, we got to do that stuff. That kind of goes with the job. But a lot of the ways you're makarev a person is by warmth, is by friendship, is by showing hospitality, by showing them the sweetness of Torah, the ne'imus of Torah. And not for everybody, but for many, many people, just learning a blot of Bava Kama with the Shaka Bataria is going to be so fascinating and eye-opening for them. So I think the Ben Torah needs to understand that they don't necessarily have to go beyond their comfort level in order to connect to someone. So I think if they wouldn't have that fear that they're going to have to answer, how does the Torah deal with evolution or something, I think many more people would be actually willing to get involved. And we need to increase that, for sure.
So some people make the argument, they go even one step further from Reb Aaron, and they say that learning Torah in and of itself is the biggest schus to be makarev someone, and I could be learning in Muncie or in Brooklyn or in Lakewood, and automatically, somehow metaphysically, someone in San Jose will become more inspired. So my question is, first of all, is this true? And second of all, is the fact that there's a 90% assimilation rate or something like that, does that mean that it's not true? Is that indicative that this is incorrect? Or is that perhaps indicative that the limud Torah that we're doing is maybe perhaps not as good or holy?
Well, there's a famous statement attributed to the Chafetz Chaim where he says the intensity of the learning in Radin affects the sneas of the fashions in Paris, meaning there's kind of a metaphysical ripple effect of the Kedushas HaTorah that comes into the world that somehow lifts up the Welt to a certain point. So I do believe it is true, meaning Torah brings Kedusha into the world. On the other hand, you obviously see that it's not taking us as far as we need to go. But even the Chavetz Chaim didn't say, you learn Torah in Radin, the guy in Paris will be a Shomer Shabbos. The Chavetz Chaim said, the skirts will be a quarter-inch lower. There is a ripple effect, but the ripple effect can be attenuated, it can be relatively weak. And I think we're mechuyev to engage the same way we engage in ishtadlus for parnasa, or ishtadlus in going to a doctor for medical treatment, even though it all comes from Hashem. So kiruv v'chaikim involves a certain amount of ishtadlus, a certain amount of caring, a certain amount of chesed. So I think everything is true. The learning brings kedusha into the belt, but we then have to augment it by actually reaching out to people. That would be part of the ishtadlus, almost b'derech hateva, that you need to open up the tzinor of bracha in many, many areas.
Is it safe to say, or maybe unsafe to say, that somebody could go through his whole life learning shtark, and then go up to Shemayim and be over lo samud al dam reyacha because he had 6 cousins who were unaffiliated, who he never really reached out to, or he could have picked up a phone and made some sort of initiation. And lo samud al dam reyacha, I think, is no less referring to the neshama than it is to the guf. And if this is the case, should this be publicized just to save innocent Jews from being over?
It's a very good point. Many Sfarim, in fact, say explicitly that part of the chiyuv of trying to be makarev someone to Yiddishkeit is a leisamen odam reyacha, pashut, because gadol hamachtiya yesem min ahorgai. In a way, sinning can even be worse than dying, in some ways. So when we do not stop people from sinning, it's as if we're not safe. We're indifferent to them killing themselves. So I think it should be talked about. I hope at maybe at a Aguda convention or various other forums. But again, I'm a little reluctant to talk about this as a chiyuv, an absolute chiyuv on everybody, because I think in many, many ways, people do have different tafkidim in life. Meaning, I think everybody can do something. And the fact that you can't be full-time kiruv, maybe you're not supposed to be full-time kiruv. Maybe your main tafkid is the beis medrash, or your family, your parnasa, whatever it might be. Everybody can do something, but as I say, I don't want to be mezalzel in any way at all of the importance of solid limud haTorah, both because of Aaron's idea that eventually you'll be able to be a bigger mashpia, and the Chavetz Chaim's idea that it brings kedusha into the world. So I'm not going to sit and tell a guy in Kailo that, you're over on Loisama every second that you're not going out and being Makarif. But I would say that you need to look out a little bit and see what is going on in the Jewish world and ask yourself if there's something you can do, even if it's small, because every small gesture does help, even if you reach only one person. Chazal say, it's not a numbers game. Every Jew is a world. Every Jew is a universe. And if you could bring another Jew to Torah, and then of course it's not just that Jew, but the ripple effects, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, etc. All of that becomes your cheshbon. The Chavis Alavavas writes, way before there was a kiruv movement or Eisha Torah or Sameach, that one has to understand, if you're makarev a person to Torah, all of the mitzvos that their family does at sof kol adoros becomes your mitzvos. He says, Eino daima, what that is, the tremendous olam haba, the tremendous sechar that never stops until the end of time. So I guess the challenge always is that we don't want to, God forbid, it's Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, we don't want to diminish the nechitzas of Talmud Torah. But I think within the framework of learning, there is more that can be done to be makarev people as well. 1 hour a week, Meiser and Zman, Shabbos guests. But again, as I say, I think you portray it a little more negatively than I would have portrayed it. But again, as I say, I don't know. I'm not there. So I'll have to rely on you.
So here's another question. There seems to be a lot of Balei Tshuva out there, and I know you work with a lot of Balei Tshuva. Seems to be, at least in America, a lot of Balei Tshuva with nowhere to go. And they feel sort of like outcasts in their own communities.
This is a huge problem. And this is even given a name in the profession. This is called like the problem of second stage kiruv, meaning the Balei Tshuva yeshivos, or Sameach, Torah, whatever, Chappelles, do a very excellent, Machon Shlomo do a very excellent job taking the non-Shomer Shabbos guy, making him from. Baruch Hashem. So we have another notch on our belt, or whatever it would be. But then the person goes back. The person does not necessarily have that much family support, gets married, and his wife may be in the same situation. And they're no longer in a yeshiva setting, and it sometimes may be very difficult for them to feel comfortable in a community in a well-established frum community where there's family connections and the like. And I have to say that sometimes there's even some bitterness attached to this, in which they feel that their yeshivas that were so nurturing and trying to make them from kind of forgets about them. Once they're from, we then go on to the next person to try to make them from. So it is a very, very serious issue. In fact, Rav Schiller Zatzal used to say that the sign of success for Or Sameach Talmud would be that you wouldn't know he's a Baal Tshuva, meaning to say that the transformation into a Ben Torah is so complete that they fit in. They fit in just like any other Ben Torah. So, in truth, yesh v'yesh. In truth, there are many Balei Tshuva who have kind of fully integrated into the frum community, and they're doing fine. Meaning, I don't want to paint this as a crisis in which every Baal Tshuva feels alienated or not part of a community. But the fact that there are, Baruch Hashem, many successes does not negate the fact that there are some who have much greater difficulty in making the adjustments. So the question would be this, and I'm really thinking out loud more than giving an answer. Is it worthwhile to create separate institutions, meaning separate batei medrash, for the alumni of a given kiruv yeshiva, or for Balei Tshuva generally? Create special minyanim, special programs in which they would feel comfortable, they would be with people with similar backgrounds, and that would be a much more comfortable environment. Or lehepech, again, I'm thinking out loud, lehepech, maybe that's giving them a crutch in which they'll never learn to walk if they can't be integrated into the broader community. This is very similar to a problem of Aliyah in Eretz Yisrael, if I could switch gears for a moment, that if you're an American or an Anglo speaker coming to Eretz Yisrael, and it's a totally new environment, is it better to send your kid to an all-English speaking cheder, in which it'll be familiar and American-like, and they'll play basketball during recess? Or lehepech, you want to raise your child in Eretz Yisrael, they should get acculturated to the norms of Israeli religious society, which is very, very different. So it's kind of a similar problem. I see the milas in both ways. I certainly see how many guys will be much more comfortable in a type of minyan of people who have gone through similar experiences. Now, one solution would be, and this is an achrayas on Rabbanim, that Rabbanim should create shuls that maybe foster an integration of both types, meaning create a shul in which Balei Tshuva are welcome, in which FFBs from births are welcome, create events, both separate events for different groupings and events in which people work together. And I think over time, as the barriers collapse and as people get to know each other better, so some of the fear and some of the hostility can vanish. So this would be an achrayas on synagogue rabbis to create welcoming environments for Balei Tshuva. And I would also say, too, there's a big achrayas on the yeshivos themselves, that they have to deal with their alumni. Baruch Hashem, yeshiva like Or Sameach has been around for more than 50 years. Torah has been around nearly that long. There's quite a lot of alumni. The question is, what are we doing for them? Are we staying in touch with them? Is it that once they leave, that's it, we're on to the next person? Or we need to still maintain that kesher? And I think there needs to be a lot more alumni programming than perhaps there is.
What would you say to a Baal Tshuva that has enormous challenges in their lives and begins to feel a little bit of resentment towards Hashem because, hey, look at all the sacrifices I made for you, and now this is what I get. I get a life where I'm estranged from my family, where I don't have the financial backing that my parents originally promised me, or whatever the challenge may be.
Yeah, so first I want to go backwards a little bit, and that is I think one of the big problems that we sometimes have in kiruv programming is we overpromise. We kind of tell the guy, you become frum, you'll have a wonderful marriage and wonderful kids, and your parents will love you and admire you, etc., etc., etc. And then when these things don't happen, there's a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. People feel they were lied to and the like. So I think it's important, number one, not to oversell your product, meaning Torah is wonderful. Torah is emes. Torah gives you a connection to the Ribono Shel Olam and Olam Haba. It does not automatically guarantee that you're going to have an easy life in this world. Life does have challenges, and part of a good chinuch is not to make believe there's not going to be challenges, but to discuss them and try to give a person coping strategies. That when things are not perfect, what do you do? Plus, of course, being available for them as they go through a crisis. The other thing that's important to stress is that the Baal Tshuva, it's very important in a Tshuva process to maintain, as far as possible, a good relationship with parents and non-religious family. That it's not always possible, I understand that, but to whatever degree possible, this situation shouldn't arise in which you're estranged from your parents. Why would you be estranged from your parents? If you treat your parents with respect, and they see that you're a mensch, and they see that you're a caring person, then by and large, most of the time, again, not all the time, most of the time, they're going to go along with it. They're going to accept it. They're going to admire you. So my 2 points before the person is in crisis is, number one, don't oversell your product by making these representations that are just not Pollyannish representations. And number two, try to focus on the importance of maintaining a good family relationship. And don't allow the frumkeit to create walls and barriers. Now, once the person is in a situation where they're facing crisis, where they're facing real problems, so once again, the role of the rabbi, the role of the rebbe, the role of the spiritual mashpia is to provide, number one, empathy, compassion. Imo anochi b'tzara. Don't delegitimate the pain that the person feels. And then talk about the practical things that can be done. I think one should try to have a very practical orientation. What can we do to make this better, B'ezras Hashem? And in many ways, if a person feels that somebody cares, that just makes it easier. That's called nosei bi'ol. I carry the yoke with somebody. That makes the yoke lighter for the person that's bearing it.
I heard you talk recently about your adoption, and if it's okay with you, can I ask you some questions about infertility? So my first question is, what practical chizik can you give to someone who is waiting years and years to have children? And I don't mean before the intellectual chizik. I mean the more practical things that you've seen from other people that have worked, or segulas, areas in Avodas Hashem to work on, brachos from particular people, because everyone obviously is scrambling for something, and everyone's trying anything and everything. And before the giving up stage, before the but even before the consideration of adoption, have you seen, and perhaps you haven't, you just were in your own little cocoon, but perhaps you have seen things that have worked, or seen what brought success to other struggling couples in this regard?
The technologies that are available for the treatment of infertility have drastically improved over the years. So as a result, the situation today is medically much more promising than it was, whatever it is, 30, 40 years ago. And that's a great bracha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that obviously the ability to advance in technology ultimately comes from the Eibishter, comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we have to be very, very grateful for those opportunities. So I think there's a lot available then that was not available now, rather, that was not available then. But one of the points that I try to make, and in my own life I try to live, is that even though having children is a great, 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 great thing, it's a great joy, and it's the first mitzvah of the Torah, and the Navi Yeshayahu says, Leisayu bara l'sheves yitzara, God did not create the world to be desolate. He created it to be inhabited. And of course, the dream of every parent of every person who gets married, and if you're not married, you hope to get married and then have children. Of course, that's emes. But one has to know that when Chazal say that when there's shalom between husband and wife, the Shekhinah is there. That is emes, even if they don't have children. One has to know that the relationship of husband and wife is holy, is sacred, is godly, even if it, for whatever reason, does not produce a biological child. And therefore one has to understand that there is something in the marriage itself that is kaddish, that has to be nurtured and has to be developed. That's a very hard mindset to absorb because we're so used to the idea that you get married and you have children, and Baruch Hashem, for most people that's how it does work, but not always. So as a result, therefore, you're living on two opposite sides of the fence at the same time. You pray, you daven, you make hishtadlus to have children, and at the same time you recognize the beauty and depth and holiness of your relationship, even if there are no children. And you can't live your life on hold while you're waiting for something to happen. You have to take every minute that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you and use it in the best way that you can use it. You can't kind of say, well, when we have children, then we'll really have a family. Husband and wife is a family as well. I'm saying adoption is obviously bringing a child into your home, but even if one is not ready for a full-fledged adoption, there is foster care, which is a temporary arrangement. You still are a machat, you still have a child that you're taking care of. There are things like learning with kids who don't have a father, etc. Children of almanas, yisaimim, taking them to shul, meaning there's all sorts of what you might call quasi-parenting, in which a man and a wife, even a couple, can have a certain shaykhus to being a major factor in a child's life, even if it's not totally their child. And remember, Chazal say that if you're malamed es ben chaveiro taira, ke'ilu yoldei, I sit and I learn with a kid whose father is not alive anymore. I do an avos ubanim with the kid. Chazal say it's ke'ilu he is my child. So one has to be machapes different ways in which they can still contribute to a child's life.
How is it expected on a man or a woman who's waiting 7 years at this point to have a child not to be jealous of their neighbors? Because that is an expectation. The Torah does not allow jealousy. Is that a Herculean ask? Is that even physically, emotionally possible?
A very, very, very hard thing. I remember years ago, the old Jewish Observer magazine used to publish open letters. Somebody wanted to bring out a certain issue, that someone was behaving a certain way. And I remember that one of these open anonymous letters was written by a woman without children, an infertile woman, who complained that her friends are always talking about their kids. And don't they realize how much pain that causes me? So she expressed that pain. But I understand that pain, and maybe they should be more sensitive. But I think she was. I think ultimately she was wrong. Although I can't judge her, maybe I would have behaved the same way. Because what you have to understand is this. This is a deep thing that's hard to understand. But if all of Klal Yisrael is guf echad, ish echad uvalev echad, and as the Balatanya says, all of our neshamos are rooted in an achdus in Shemayim, then when any Jew has a simcha, it's my simcha. If I'm a single person who's been going out on shidduchim, and my friend gets a shidduch first, I should be misameach in their shidduch. Another couple has children when I've been trying so hard with my wife, I should be misameach in that. And I should train myself, even though when I first think this, it's not going to be sincere. Baruch Hashem, that Hashem gave this bracha into the world. And, as Sefer Achinuch says, Adam nifal kefi pu'ulaisav. Our thoughts and our emotions get affected by our actions. You say it enough, you'll come to believe it. Baruch Hashem, I am so happy that they have a child. Another Jew was born into the world. Very hard. It is very hard. I'm maskim. But I think ultimately the avodas hamidas that Hashem wants us to do is we should have simcha in the good fortune. Reb Meir Simcha, the Meshech Chachma, writes somewhere that it is much harder to rejoice in somebody else's simcha than to feel sorry for their pain. I feel sorry. Somebody suffers. I feel empathy. I feel compassion. But to rejoice in their simcha, that's even a higher madriga. And that's what we should try to do.
Okay, so to pivot to our last subject here, I think it's very apropos to discuss a little bit about Eretz Yisrael, especially with the barrage of rockets and the ongoing war. But I want to clarify certain things that I think a lot of people could use clarification on. And that is, what exactly is Ahavas Eretz Yisrael? Is that diraisa, a mitzvah that we just gloss over? Is it an emotion? Is it a lifestyle? Is it a political identity? We see extremes on both sides of the aisle. We have people who will march and die to the flag of Israel and will say that it's Ahavas Eretz Yisrael. We will have people who will never utter the words Israel or never discuss it for fear of Zionism or whatever. What is Ahavas Eretz Yisrael?
Without getting into Zionist debates, obviously Eretz Yisrael is not the same as Medinat Yisrael. Medinat Yisrael is a political entity. And there are those who were against Hakamat HaMedina, like the Turi Karta. There are those that were positive for it. And that's a major debate that to some degree still goes on even today. But Eretz Yisrael, as the land of Israel, first of all, there's a machlokes rishonim. According to the Ramban, there is a mitzvah d'oraisa to live in Eretz Yisrael. According to the Rambam, there seems to be no mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, but he's still mishabeach, the holiness of living here. The Nesivas HaMishpat in a letter actually says that those who live in the Golah are by definition following the Shitas HaRambam lahalacha, that there's no chiyuv. Like the Ramban, there would be a chiyuv. Rav Moshe Feinstein, on the other hand, took the position that even like the Ramban, it's only a mitzvah kiyumis, meaning if you live here, you have a mitzvah, but you're not mechuyev to live here. So there are many, many different opinions regarding Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. But in terms of Avas Eretz Yisrael, well, that's a good question. What does it mean to love Eretz Yisrael? I mean, do I love the land? Well, there were Gedolim who would kiss the dirt itself. But I think Avas Eretz Yisrael is to recognize that this is the land in which Hashem makes his presence more manifest. And therefore, a person might feel, I want to live here because this is where Hashem wants me to live. This is where more mitzvahs of the Torah can be mekoyim, like Shemitah, etc. And this is where I can have a deeper connection to the Ribbon Shalom. And therefore, my love of Eretz Yisrael comes from my love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, wanting a deeper relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. again, it has nothing to do, in a sense, with Zionism. It has nothing to do with the state of Israel. Now, again, I happen to be somewhat of a Zionist, and I support the state, or at least I want to help the state do defense and everything else. But the point I'm making is that love of Eretz Yisrael does not have to be connected at all with your stance on Zionism or Medinat Yisrael. Those are two separate issues. Many Niturikartas live in Eretz Yisrael.
My question would be then, if that is true, then why is it historically just for lack of better terms, the more left-leaning, more modern communities have ran towards quote-unquote Ahavas Yisrael or Ahavas Yisrael, and I mean Ahavas Eretz Yisrael, and the more yeshivish, more right-wing, it's just not a focus. Because if it, in fact, Ahavas Yisrael is essential to being a frum Jew, being a religious Jew, so then why is it that one puts a focus on it, one doesn't? And as this is all assuming that the focus that they do put on is in fact real, genuine love of Hashem that's being manifested through the love of His land, as opposed to love of a land and Zionism and finally being a country like every other country. And Zionism is really a front for just being like everyone else. So if it in fact is essential.
No, it's a big chisaron. The Ger Rebbe, I think the Beis Yisrael, once remarked that we've lost three things that were stolen from us by the non-religious Jews. They stole Tanakh, or they stole Nach, because Nach became identified with the Haskalah, so now a frum Jew can't learn Nach anymore. They stole, so that was stolen by the Maskilim. Tshuva was stolen by the Balei Tshuva, meaning to say, all of us should be doing Tshuva. We think, oh, that's a Baal Tshuva thing. And Zionism, which is Ahavas Eretz Yisrael, was stolen by the Zionists. It got hijacked. Zionists took over Zionism, and Balei Tshuva took over Tshuva, and the Maskilim took over Nach. Which means part of what's going on is that because the endeavor of settling the land got so identified with a political ideology, much of which was against the Torah, so the whole idea became treif. The whole idea became puzzle. The whole idea became something you can't associate yourself with. Guilt by association, to be frank. Now, if you go back to the early years of the Zionist movement, you had the Netziv, Chovevei Tzion, and the like. You did have, real gedolim who were endorsing moving Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, agricultural settlements, and the like. But as the political Zionist movement got more and more powerful, and they kind of took over Israeli society, so the whole idea of Eretz Yisrael became kind of treif. It became kind of left-wing. It became identified as connected to chilonim and secularism. And as a result, as the Ger Rebbe said, Zionism was hijacked by the Zionists. And that's a chabal. The question is, can we claim it back?
I was going to say, should a religious Jew celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut?
It depends what you mean. If you're talking about saying Hallel with the bracha, I would say no, because halachically we don't create new holidays and new scenarios beyond those of Chazal. Should a religious Jew feel a certain Simcha on Yom Ha'atzmaut, a certain Hakaras Hatov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and even Hakaras Hatov to the Medina for creating an infrastructure? I believe the answer should be yes, because in spite of all of the fighting we have with the state, in spite of all of the tightness and disagreements we have, Lamaisa, an infrastructure was created that enables the flourishing of Torah, and for that we have to have Hakaras Hatov. If the Rambam writes that part of why Hanukkah is a yumpt is because we're grateful for the Malchus Chashmonai, even though the Malchus Chashmonai eventually disintegrated and they persecuted and even murdered Chachamim. But we're still grateful for having a Jewish Malchus. I think that would indicate, according to the Rambam, a certain simcha for Yom Ha'atzmaut as well. That doesn't mean we ignore the chesrenis, and that doesn't mean we agree with everything the Medina does, and that doesn't mean we're not going to have machlokas with them when we need to have a machlokas. But some basic notion of Hakaras Hatov, I think, is appropriate. And the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is that if we are makir taiv to the other side, so to speak, they will come to be machshav what we stand for as well. This is Shlomo HaMelech's pasuk in Mishlei, Kamayim apanim l'panim, Kain leif adam li'adam, as water reflects the face that you show it. I show the water a smiling face, I get a smile. Zok Shlomo HaMelech, a person will feel that which I show them. I show them gratitude, I show them respect, they're going to feel gratitude and respect for what I stand for. And that's the absence of that is why the machloksim between religious and secular never get resolved in Israel, because each side looks at the other in the worst possible light instead of seeing them in a positive way.
What does it mean? Like, what practically would it look like for a frum Jew to demonstrate hakaras hatov?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was walking with an avrech yesterday, and we passed some soldiers, and I didn't say. So it's a time to me. I actually didn't say anything, but he made a point of looking at them in the eye and saying, in Hebrew, "Thank you very much for all you're doing. We appreciate it." And they were a little surprised, and I thought that was a very, very nice thing to do. And I wish I would have thought of it. I didn't think of it at that particular moment. But those are little things. Police, garbage men. There's a lot of infrastructure here that the Torah world wouldn't be able to really flourish without all of that infrastructure. And we need to have hakaras hatov. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz used to say this a lot. Obviously one of the hot issues in Israel right now, a very important hot issue, is the drafting of B'nai Torah and Charedim into the army, right? This is a bitter, divisive issue that may even bring down the government, although probably in the middle of a new war it probably won't come to that. Of course, this is an issue that we have to fight over and do what we can. But somehow it got turned into disparaging soldiers and saying who needs them, and they're useless, and they're doing nothing. And that's an avla. That is an avla. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, during the 6-Day War and other wars, always made the point that we have, whether we encourage going into the army or we discourage going into the army, we have to have hakaras hatov for people, religious or not, who are endangering their lives for Klal Yisrael and for Eretz Yisrael. And when you turn the issue of Charedim in the army into disparaging Chayolim, that's a lack of hakaras hatov, and that is a mida gerua b'yaiser.
Just in closing, can you give a chizik for the hundreds of thousands of regular Jews out there who are just trying to be good people and make a living and live in today's confusing world? Can you give them a piece of advice that would keep them on fire in their Yiddishkeit throughout their lives?
Life is tough because Hashem wants to bring out goodness in us that otherwise would not come without these challenges. But Hashem is ultimately a God of love. He loves every Jew. He's machshav every Jew. Every Jew has a purpose in the world. And when times are tough, speak to Hashem in your own words, besides davening and besides tehillim. In your own words, say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, things are very rough for me. Can you help me? Can you give me the strength? Can you give me the insight? And although it's not likely you're going to hear Hashem speak to you, you're not going to hear it in that way. But I think, your heart will be lighter, and you'll feel that you have the wherewithal to go ahead and do what you need to do. And that's also Hashem answering the prayer. Hashem is answering your tefillah by giving you that kayach. So don't give up. Don't give up. Try to appreciate life. See the blessings even in the difficulties. And when difficulties come, always ask yourself, how can this make me a better person? And then you're taking the difficulty and you're making it a gift.
Beautiful. Rabbi Breitowitz, thank you very much for joining. And continued hatzlacha.
Thank you so much. You should have much
work.
hatzlacha in your avodas hakodesh, and you should go mechayol el chayil.